A recent survey
Good morning, everyone. Welcome back to WGU Live. We are here live at the SHRM 2019 annual conference in Las Vegas. We are at the Las Vegas Convention Center with about 18,000 of our closest friends in the HR community. We are WGU, Western Governors University, and we are here representing as the College of Business and our programs in human resource management. But more importantly, we're taking a look and examining topics that happen in life and in the workplace and how that relates to us as professionals and to people. Whether you're a student of HR, whether you're an HR practitioner, whether you're in school at all or not, these issues affect your lives because of the fact that we all have to work, and the fact that work, as we're learning, is a composition of people. And so these are very interesting topics. So if you're rejoining us from our first session, welcome back. If you're just joining us, today we will be talking about creating a safe and inclusive workplace. I am joined with Dr. Nicole Whitehead, as well as Dr. Rashmi Prasad, and I'll let them introduce themselves. I am not Dr. Silverman, but I am Aaron Silverman, and I am thrilled to be here with you guys to talk about diversity and inclusion. So just real quick for the audience and so people know, Dr. Nicole Whitehead, please tell us about yourself.
My name is Dr. Nicole Whitehead, as you stated, and I have been in higher education for about 9 years, and prior to that spent a fair amount of time in industry and corporations, and the topics that we're discussing today are near and dear to my heart, related to giving individuals access and allowing them to be their authentic selves and be able to come into the workplace and feel that the environment is such that they can grow and be able to connect with different people. So I'm excited about this opportunity and about the conversation.
Yeah, we appreciate you being here. And you're with the Chief Human Resource Officer of Auburn University.
Yes, Auburn
currently.
University in Montgomery.
Okay.
Yes.
And before that, prior to your 9 years in education, you were in industry. Is that correct?
Yes, and I was in multiple roles, mainly operations leadership, and transitioned to human resources in e-commerce and banking, and learned a lot just about different populations, diverse individuals, and how to be able to connect in different ways and allow individuals to have pathways that may be different than what we see as traditional.
Wow, that's great. So your perspective, I think, in traditional industry roles as well as in an academic institution, which I tend to have some differences. It will be very valuable. Thank you for being here.
Thank you.
And Rashmi, please.
Well, I'm Rashmi Prasad, or as Aaron refers to me as Dr. Prasad.
But I could call you Rashmi.
You can, please.
And Nicole, can we call you Nicole?
Please.
Wonderful.
Yeah, and WGU is very much a first name culture from our president to every employee. So I'm Dean of the College of Business at WGU, and prior to that, I had the same role, Dean of the College of Business at the University of Alaska in Anchorage. And I'm just reflecting on my role when I was in Alaska, which is a very remote region, but has an amazing diversity. There were 93 different languages in the Anchorage Public School. There was a tremendous awakening of the Alaska Native community in the last 2 generations, and there are great innovations for Indigenous peoples. And so the issues of inclusion, exclusion, were very much in front of you, and they were sometimes invisible. When they became visible, they were the most relevant, the most important things. And I reflect on some of what was discussed this morning, including the first person introduced was someone who had a criminal record in the past and then had the struggles to find work after that. And I can recall when I was at the University of Alaska, it took once in a while a student would come and open up to me and confide that they also had a prison record. So it is not, and it is actually much more common in our society than we think, and that the lack of opportunity for those with criminal records is actually a very major social issue that we oftentimes neglect. But I'm getting ahead of myself. I was only supposed to introduce myself.
It's quite all right. Well, in fact, Rashmi, your introduction of yourself is very much a part of who you are, because you are so introspective, and how you expand upon your thought process, that is who you are. So you were giving us your background just by talking, and that I certainly appreciate that.
Thank you. I've been accused of being a verbal processor from time to time, but you put such a nice packaging around that, Aaron.
So just so everyone knows out there watching, we will be trying to take some questions if there's time. We understand that there may be hundreds to thousands of you across the country that are watching this live right now, and what we're experiencing, and some of what Rashmi just alluded to, our general session with Brene Brown, which we'll get into in just a second, was a very, very powerful talk, including the intro with the president of SHRM, Johnny C. Taylor, and brought to light a very expanded view of diversity and inclusion. And we're going to get to that in just a second. So if you guys have questions or comments, please leave them in the comment section. You can also include the hashtag WGU@SHRM. That's WGU@SHRM. And if we have time, we will certainly get to those. And if you are enjoying the conversation, if you like what we're talking about, please share it, please like. We of course want to see that love and see those little hearts and thumbs go up. Even though we can't see it, virtually we want to see it. That'd be great to see. Thank you so much. So let's just give a preview of what just happened. We were in a general session, and Johnny C. Taylor, the president of the Society for Human Resource Management, introduced a topic, and it happened to be very salient with what we're talking about, diversity and inclusion.
Yeah.
And it was he was introducing the keynote Brene Brown, who talks about courage, bravery, and leadership. And oftentimes I think that diversity and inclusion, we think about things that are very, very visible. Gender and race can be things that are very visible, and building programs in the workplace that help to elevate those communities. I took a couple of notes when I was in the session, and I wrote down the incarcerated, the disabled, people that experience chronic pain, people with mental health issues, which I think we all experience at some point in time, veterans, older workers, experiences of ageism. These are all areas where there needs to be diversity and inclusion. And the thing that struck me the most is Johnny said that they all must be supported equally. And I found that to be very interesting. So I would love to get you guys' take on what you just heard and experienced, and how that relates to diversity and inclusion. And how about you start us off, Nicole?
Absolutely. I was very struck by the same thing that you took from the session this morning. And I think when we talk about supporting them equally, it just expanded for me the thought of equally and in a customized way, because there's not a broad brush that we can paint and say that to be able to be inclusive, we can do this one thing and it will provide that element of support and inclusion for all of those groups. And it made me think of putting a face behind what those backgrounds are. For example, we talked about the incarceration piece, and I have a family member who, when she was 17 years old, had a felony record, and she's now 49, and just a year ago was that record expunged for her. So I watched her struggle, for the last 30 plus years with trying to build a household for her family, and she even ran into challenges with being able to apply for financial aid because she had a felony record. So there are so many systems that are built upon archaic thoughts of the choice you made 30 years ago that could impact you the rest of your life. So that now you can't work and you don't have access to education. These types of decisions and systems, have to be broken down at its core. So when I think of the segmentation of the populations, it just makes me think more about what systems and structures do we have in place that we need to, completely disband to be able to support individuals in those environments. And I can admit and say, I became a person that was assessing talent probably in the early or late 90s. And I remember someone saying to me, if that person has a felony record and they mark it on their application, you don't even consider them at all. It didn't matter what the reason was. So myself as an HR professional had to make changes in the biases that I have, that when I come into an environment, you can't just look at what someone marks on a box, but look at their narrative and the story and what do they bring to the table, and how can you create a situation where their talents are valued and not just the poor decision they may have made one time in their life.
It's so true, and especially if you think back to and what Brene was saying. She was talking about being in Silicon Valley, and in Silicon Valley they have an attitude that failure is necessary. And if a worker, an employee goes a couple of years without having a significant failure, that means they're not learning and they're not growing. So it's almost as if we're limiting ourselves by having that check the box mentality.
Absolutely, and we talked about also, it's not the responsibility of the person that's being discriminated against to be able to say, hey, I need you to create a new system for me. As leaders, we have that responsibility. We have a calling to be able to create an environment where, we're constantly mining for, is our environment what our core values say they are? Are we living the brand and how we treat each other and the opportunities that we're giving people that may be unique, in certain situations? And, I think about even when we talked about disabled, I remember an individual coming to interview for an operations manager job in a facility that I worked in Chicago, and he had one arm. And I remember the interviewer coming to say to me, he won't be able to do this job. And I said, why are you saying that? And she said, well, because, we're constantly moving, we're doing all this data entry, and, him having one arm, we would be setting him up for failure. And it was a teachable moment for me to be able to say to that leader, that hiring manager, you're operating on a bias that's incorrect, that you're already closing the door for this individual before he even had an opportunity to tell what his experience, his background, and how could he come in and how could we create accommodations or an environment where he could be successful instead of looking at limiting his potential because of something we see visually. And I can certainly say he came in, he knocked everybody's socks off, and what was interesting is the only thing he needed was a left-hand facing keyboard, and he was one of our top performers. So if we would have operated under the bias that individual, just by looking at this individual had, we would have missed out on a great talent, in our institution. One of the greatest advocates for diversity and inclusion, that we ended up having in that facility. So.
It's interesting, like as someone may be disabled, that person adapts to their life.
That's right.
And how they go about doing things, and yet in the workplace, we could be so rigid and not adapt as well. That's interesting. And to reference what you were talking about, I wrote that down too. It is not the job of the discriminated to spark the conversation. That leaders have to excavate the unsaid. And I wonder, Rashmi, as a leader, you've been a leader in academia and business for so long. What does that mean to you? How did you feel about that comment, and then about the general session that you took away?
Well, I think that that was well said, that leaders have to be introspective. They have to question themselves and their biases. So, nowadays the concept of implicit bias has become more well understood, widely understood. And so that also applies to a leader, is that are there policies, are there mindsets that are counterproductive, and they're informed by my implicit biases. So there has to be some change from above. It can't just be grassroots change, which is there. The grassroots advocacy is important, it's democracy, it's the American way, but there also has to be, you have to be brave leaders who choose to not only see things differently, but also question their own histories and find fault with themselves and introspect. So I think that was a very good call to action to leaders. Some of my takeaways from the morning session, it was really powerful, impactful. I think it packed a punch, emotional punch, as it should, because in business education ideal business education is the education of head, heart, and hands. And this morning was very much an education of the heart, or a call to the heart. You know, if you're going to be a good leader, you should not have a sick heart. Another takeaway, very briefly, is the whole skills gap, war for talent, need for mastery education. These are big themes now for the 21st century. So it's not just a question of performing some kind of charity for those who are differently abled, shall we say. It's that we need all talent. We have a 3.5% unemployment rate, and also the kinds of skills that we need. The supply of those is in short supply. So we actually need to reform education so that education doesn't just function as a filter, right? That we accept those who are best prepared from birth, or even from before birth. That we have to find ways in education to not just filter, but actually to help each individual reach their highest potential, to attain mastery, because the 21st century economy requires it. You know, we could have a world economy in which there are billions of opportunities and billions of people who don't have the skills at the same time. The billions of opportunities that are going without any subscription. So I think that the skills gap is also a very relevant part of the diversity and inclusion conversation.
Right. That's a really interesting point. And Nicole, I think you probably have some very interesting insights on this coming from industry and higher education. And with all of us being in higher education and knowing that the population of 18 to 24 year olds that's declining. And that's traditionally where institutions of higher education got their new students from.
That's right.
We have this widening skills gap in all parts of industry.
Yeah.
So what, as you said, that skills gap needs to be addressed, and it can also be addressed through diversity and inclusion. What are your thoughts on that?
I think when we think about the diversity and inclusion, we also are thinking about generational diversity. And we talked about that a little bit after Martha Stewart's presentation yesterday, where she challenged people to not look at, because someone is a certain age, they're no longer qualified for a particular role. But as you continue to grow and learn, when you think of a diverse environment, it isn't just, what one looks like or what their background is. It's, how do you take all of these backgrounds and skills and talents and create a team of individuals who can function heading in the same direction towards a common vision and mission. And so I think it's not, always as easy as we say it. And I think the piece of this, when we think of higher education, there has to be this part of diversity and inclusion that we're teaching, whether you're a millennial or baby boomer or Gen X, that we have all these individuals in the higher ed space and in the workplace together all at the same time. So how do you create learning and development frameworks that even include things like diversity, inclusion, cultural competence that years ago we never talked about. I know when I was in college, and I won't say my age, but early on, nobody was talking and teaching me about bias and, are you uncomfortable, and being uncomfortable in my uncomfort and it driving me to be better instead of, creating a silence in how we're interacting with each other. So I think being able to, in a way that's meaningful, that people can add some skills and talents to their toolkit, no matter if they came from an environment where they were incarcerated or they're disabled or they're historically underrepresented. How do we ensure that the learning and development that we bring them into represent the core values and the brand and the mission of the institution or the corporation?
It's that reminds me of another thing that was said, that America values newness and youth. And I feel like there's a correlation there between newness and lifelong learning. We talk about lifelong learning a lot. And if an organization provides development to their employees, if an HR professional wants to go back and get a graduate degree, there's a newness to that. There's a youthfulness to that, if that's what we want to term it, a youthfulness. But it's a newness. People are constantly transforming themselves. And I know we're going to talk about this in an upcoming session as well. But how do we take that mindset and propel it into this idea of lifelong learning? So can diversity and inclusion, by having those programs, Rashmi, promote lifelong learning? What do you think?
Lifelong learning is another popular term, but I think that before it really has life, it does not have life yet.
Yeah.
It's a concept. I think that this is an opportunity, a great opportunity for the American culture to introspect about its values. You mentioned the premium that's based on youth. I once met a gentleman who's now India's ambassador to Brazil. Mm-hmm. He was a diplomat in the United States at the time. A very introspective man. One of his reflections was, there's such a liability associated with getting older. Getting older is harder in the United States.
Yeah.
People are desperate to appear younger. I mean, I don't even have to tell you about what troubles people go to. This is a case in which I think that while that is not a bad thing, a youth culture is not a bad thing, but it is bad if it devalues experience and age. I'll tell you, in the traditional Indian culture, for instance, that phase of life, which we might call retirement, is not called retirement. It's called something called, the Sanskrit is Bana Prastha, means, and it's a period. Bana Prastha. I'll translate the Sanskrit for you later. But what it essentially means, it's a period in which the kids have grown up, your main obligations to society are past. Now it's a time for you to either turn inward in terms of exploring aesthetic, artistic, or other kinds of values and missions. So to go more deeply into something and to be more creative. So it's actually to see the world again with with fresh eyes. Not that now I'm too old, now my hair is all these things. It's that in fact, this is a great opportunity. It's a wonderful phase of life. So cutting to the American scene and looking at the stage this morning with so many older folks being shown as also valuable and in the workplace, the key to so many of our challenges of inclusion and exclusion actually is to create ties across all these boundaries. What do I mean? I mean literally someone with a lot of experience who may have a few gray hairs being a mentor, a critical person in the life of a younger professional or a student. So we can actually have these ladders of opportunity that are based on mentoring and advising, and especially if we can make them not just ladders of advising within the circle, so that it's within one community, but it's across. So male mentors of women, female mentors to men, across lines of gender, race, geography, class. I think that would create social wealth, that these are the ties that are missing. So I think that, again, not only the skills gap, but the potential for knowledge and learning across boundaries.
Sure.
And of developing careers, and also in valuing those who have experience. That experience is golden. You're not just being put out to pasture. So I think this is a great opportunity for the American society, but we have to introspect. Why do we place such a premium on youth? Alone?
Right. It's very interesting, and you think about, it might be easy it's not easy to talk about, but here we can have a discussion about this right now. Enacting that is very different. And so Nicole, from your experience, you're Chief Human Resource Officer of Auburn, that I assume that you're trying to enact a lot of these policies, these creating an inclusion framework.
Sure.
Where do you even start? How do you begin this and work toward it?
Well, and I will say in our environment, we recently made a decision and said, we want a university-wide, view of what diversity, inclusion, equity, and social justice looks like. Because it's, when you look at all the other pieces, when you start talking about individuals who have been convicted of crimes, or there's things that are going on in the environment that we're not insulated from those things anymore. So when you think about historically, we would tell people, leave your personal life at home or your social activism at home, and things like social media and Facebook and all these things have now brought all of these things to light. So how do you harness those things in a way that create an environment that could be challenging, where maybe I don't support, exactly what you said, but I value you and your experience and being able to say it. So we've just created a university-wide diversity, equity, and inclusion committee. I am the co-chair along with one of our deans in our sciences department. And even in the choice of the two of us, he's vastly different than me. We don't think the same way, we don't have the same experiences, and the individuals that we selected for the team on purpose identified with different categories within our institution. So there are students, there's faculty, there's staff, there are individuals who openly identify as LGBTQ, and there are some individuals that are disabled within our group. We have a veteran within our group. So bringing that converge of individuals together, and I will say a convergence is what's happening right now, is hearing all of their voices and then building a strategic plan around diversity, equity, inclusion, and social justice that represent all those voices, all those faces, all of those narratives that they bring forward. And I think putting a face behind the story is very important. That there are people sitting in my group that we have individuals that are from Pakistan that work with us. And when they tell the story and they say how they grew up and what happened in their life, it exposes us to different cultures, different experiences, where if I don't hear you and say, I don't notice color, I don't notice that you're different, well, then you're devaluing the experiences that I bring to the table. Difference is not a bad thing. It's what actually challenges us to be innovative in bringing all the pieces together to move us forward.
We don't know what we don't know, and unless we are upfront and we include different voices in these groups, we're not going to know how to address them, will we? And so that's interesting. Now that we're having these groups, and I wonder, with you guys' experience, what are some of the biggest shifts in relation to diversity and inclusion that you've seen over the last 5, 10, 15 years in industry and higher education, just in general?
Nicole, do you want to take that first? What shifts have you seen in industry and practice? You're front and center in the profession.
I would say even just more of a awareness that we even have these different segmentations that, 10, 15 years ago, we weren't having conversations about individuals who have criminal backgrounds and how do you make them or create an environment where they can still be employable. So I think the discussion is shifting, being able to take people as their whole self, very similar to what Brene Brown talked about before. There's such a stigma around mental health and individuals, whether they have disabilities or not, that having some open dialogue to be able to put some solutions in place to be able to address these things. And, I'll be remiss to not bring up the political climate. I mean, there are so many things that are happening now, within our government that affect our day-to-day lives, whether it's at a higher ed institution or within a corporate environment. I even think about some of the decisions that we just made, that we had a Confucius Institute, and there were conversations around whether or not, a U.S. institution should continue, to be able to have those institutions in place with some of the other things that are going on in the environment. So I would just say the shift in the different areas that are coming forward that impact our ability to be diverse, inclusive, and have an environment when, government regulations and all those things also impact what we do from day to day.
Yeah, and I'd say just addressing the climate, that it is a time of paradox, because I think that you see big intergenerational differences. If you're below the age of 40 in the United States, you're much more inclusive. You're you have fewer of the stigmas or hang-ups about things like race. It's a remarkable progress and change. I mean, I came to the United States as a 10-year-old some 40 plus years ago, and it was a remarkable progress of kind of, let's say, reconciliation among the races. And so I think that you see the culture, and actually around the world, you see the cultures on the ground embracing tolerance and becoming aware of past injustices. But at the same time, we are in an economic period in which the barriers are going up, that there have been many who have lost out on the economic success of especially the working class, blue-collar workers. And so that there's a kind of a reaction against free trade, the open economy, and the free movement of goods, ideas, and people. So it is a time of paradox. I think that there needs to be, I think, a special attention to the economic costs, the dislocations of rapid technological change. Otherwise, this sort of paradox continues. I think that in many ways, open communication and culture is moving towards a more broadly accepting and tolerant society around the world, and yet I think the economic dislocations always present a threat, because in the end, I mean, if it's hard times and I don't have a job and my life is going bad, I mean, there's a desire to want to point the finger somewhere. So I think that's the kind of paradox that we're living through.
Wow. The couple of topics that were brought up, Me Too, the LGBTQ movement, mental health too. While I don't know that there's been a social movement around mental health, but there's a lot more awareness and talk about it. And can you guys expand upon that idea? Like, how have social movements like Me Too, how have they impacted the diversity and inclusion efforts within the workplace? And you talked about grassroots. Is it grassroots, or, as it was discussed before, is it leadership that is providing a voice for the movement?
I would say it's leadership that's providing the voice. I mean, you have your constituents even within the Me Too movement. These issues are long-standing. When you think of things of access for women and being able to have a seat at the table, we continue to hear those type of things, and you have to deal with the underlying current that's preventing those individuals from having that access in the beginning. So when I see things like Me Too and other movements, it takes leaders to be able to embrace and say, I will not stand for these injustices to continue to go on in our environment. And so you could keep complaining about it, but if you don't ensure that your framework, your policies, your procedures, how we treat each other, it isn't aligned with who you say you are. How could a woman not be able to have a CEO position in an area where you're saying your core values are inclusivity? It really is, an oxymoron in some respects to say, that we support difference, but then that difference can only go so far. I was part of a search recently, and a group asked me to come in and look at the job description and why weren't more minorities applying for the job? Why weren't more women applying for the job? And when I looked at it and looked at some of the essential responsibilities and things they were asking for, they were in a traditional position where they were asking for so many years of an experience in a field where women aren't traditionally represented, that the way you've written this job description pretty much ensures that there are no women that meet this criteria, or no minorities that meet this criteria, because this isn't a traditional area that those populations we're interested in. So I think when we talk about the system and ensuring that the infrastructure is appropriate, we have to turn over every avenue and have those difficult discussions. And I remember sitting in the room, and all of the faculty that were part of that discussion, initially there was this discomfort in the room of, and I remember saying to them, like, why is everyone so uncomfortable? And the thought was, I didn't do this on purpose. So whether it's, on purpose, whether it's intentional, whether it's disparate treatment or disparate impact, we still have to uncover those things that are preventing us, for the need of even having a Me Too, if the environment was such or the structure didn't, allow those types of things.
So you just answered that perfectly, and while at the same time teeing up what we wanted to get into next is the identification. there's so much awareness. We know as leaders, as people in business, as educators, that problems exist that need to be changed. We're fortunate to work for an organization at WGU where diversity and inclusion and the programs around that have always been very, very robust. It was built that way. We're still a very young organization and only 22 years old, and the scale that we've achieved has so much to do with the fact that we built the culture for diversity and inclusion. But so many companies and organizations have legacy thinking, different ways of thinking, and that's just due to being in the marketplace, being in the world longer, and having to catch up, let's say, to a younger organization that might have been thinking differently. So how does an organization and their leaders, how do they identify these problems to actually begin addressing them?
Well, I'd say, Aaron, that company cultures tend to be conservative. So the founding period of a company is the culture is imprinted at that point. So in a sense, it's frozen in time, or it's not that it's exactly frozen in time, but it tends not to change with the times. So I think that the influence of leaders in an organization is critical.
Yeah.
Leaders send signals, leaders unfreeze mindsets, leaders question cultural practices that may have outlived their usefulness. So I think that it really, the burden is on leadership. The burden of change is on leadership. Absolutely. In an organization.
Absolutely.
Just put it that.
And I would just add to that, we talk a lot about disrupting the environment. I think in this area, we need to erupt it. I mean, so when you start thinking, yes, we need to erupt it. So when you think of volcanoes, and what's, the lava is just waiting to explode, that's the situation we're in right now, is that we have to get it out. And I think the longer that we continue to allow the eruption to brew, those are the times where people don't feel that they can be their authentic self when they come to work. That, we were in a meeting and I made the statement to someone in the meeting, hey, I want everybody to be their authentic self, and if something is moving you to speak, speak, and we may not agree, but we'll figure out how to, navigate the dialogue. And I remember someone saying, you don't want me to be my authentic self, because who I am, authentically would offend so many people. And so I think that piece of offense, what do we do with offense? How do we manage offense? How do we, teach people to disagree in healthy ways? It's important for us to be able to grow our environment, because conflict is healthy. Healthy conflict, but not that piece of, screaming and yelling at each other, but how do I disagree with you but still value you in the process?
How do you have those tough conversations?
And yet I think that in so many ways, bringing your authentic self to work, when that authentic self is revealed, it's not so scary. Mm-hmm. What we think of as sort of a mythological Tolkien-esque creature with three horns, it's just people. I mean, look at the perception of LGBTQ people.
That's right.
I mean, they're just people.
Yeah.
They're just people, and that whole fear that the term homophobia was well put together. It was fear.
Yeah.
And so I think that opening up, I think it reduces the fear.
Yeah.
It's just people.
Yeah.
There are real issues that come up, and I had someone who identifies as gay that said to me, Nicole, I would prefer we don't cater from this particular chicken establishment, and I won't say any names, but I would prefer that we didn't, because they don't support LGBTQ initiatives. So how do you deal with that in your environment, that there are certain groups of people that want to continue to support this establishment?
So my response is, you're the CHRO.
Yes. I just said bring brown bag lunches instead. We won't have to worry about it.
I think one of the best ways, and I think you just said it too, is about fear and how we can wrap all this stuff, because these are tough conversations.
Yes.
And what we learned in this session and what you just said is people are fearful, and we need to focus more on our vulnerabilities.
Yeah.
We need to focus on uncertainty and risk and bring in emotion, because those are innate human traits that we can embrace. And those are all the characteristics that allow us to create programs and have dialogue around these tough conversations and reduce the uncertainty, reduce the risk, and embrace that fear and emotion. And I think that we've opened up a lot of great talking points here for the audience. And again, if you guys have been watching and listening, we hope that you have been commenting below. We apologize we can't get to questions. As you can see, there is so much to talk about, and we could sit here and probably talk for another 2 hours and still keep going. But unfortunately, we have to go. Because you have someplace to be. I know Nicole has someplace to be, and we have to get ready for our next session that will be coming up at 4:30 Eastern Time, Reinventing Yourself by Furthering Your Education, where I guarantee some more of these themes and topics are going to be coming out. So we'll be with our Chancellor of WGU Nevada, Spencer Stewart, as well as our course instructor, Sunil, will be back for that conversation. I thank you so much. In just a couple of quick 20 to 30 seconds, is there anything, one final thought that you can provide for everyone that's listening in terms of diversity and inclusion?
Just going back to our main speaker this morning, Brene Brown, courage and fear. I think that the courage and fear themes were throughout our conversation, and for her, the barrier to being brave is not that we shouldn't have any fear. We will all have fear, but it's self-protection.
Right.
It's self-protection, and so the real courage is to face your fears and to be vulnerable and not to put that armor around your heart.
Wonderful.
And I would just say being vulnerable is not about an emotional response, and that being able to accept people and how they respond to fear and courage and help them to be able to transition. That, as she said this morning, you can't be courageous without being vulnerable.
Absolutely. Can't be courageous without being vulnerable. Thank you for taking the time to be with us this afternoon. Again, join us at 4:30 for Reinventing Yourself through Higher Education. Reinventing yourself by furthering your education. Talking is hard sometimes. We thank you for being here and joining us live at the SHRM 2019 Annual Conference. Thank you so much, Rashmi. Thank you, Nicole.
Thank you.
Thanks,
We'll
Aaron.
see you guys soon.